Good morning, I'm Michael Popa with Mainstream Coalition and the Voter Network. And on behalf of KS Fair Maps, thank you so much for joining us today. Over 375 who've registered for this event. We're learning more about the process of redistricting in Kansas and how you can speak up for fair maps. Just a few FYIs, we have closed captioning available today. If you don't see that, just click the CC button on the bottom of your screen and then click show subtitles. Chat is disabled, but we do have Q&A enabled. So you can use a Q&A feature to ask questions. We'll be saving time at the end for all audience questions. There's also, or should be, an option to upvote those questions so that we can see which are most important to you, our audience. And then finally, a recording of this webinar will be available for viewing after the event at ksfairmaps.org. As you know, last Friday evening, the redistricting committee leadership announced the listening tour schedule. And they scheduled 14 town halls across Kansas. The only problem, or one of the problems, is that the schedule is jam-packed in 5 days. Each town hall is only 75 minutes and most are scheduled during the workday. We still haven't heard anything about the official procedure or rules for the town halls and nothing about accessibility for everyone. And of course, these town halls are being held before the US Census data has been released. KS Fair Maps has already been working to educate the public on the redistricting process, but when this town hall schedule was released, we kicked it into high gear. We reached out to trusted partners and we put this event together for you today. So without further ado, I would like to invite Mary Galligan with the League of Women Voters on screen to tell us a little bit more about redistricting. Mary?
Thank you, Michael. So this morning I'm going to get started by talking about two things that are relevant to this process. One is the relationship between the census, apportionment, and redistricting, and the other is the process that will be used for redistricting in Kansas. Next slide. The key terms that are used when we talk about redistricting are really three: census, apportionment, and redistricting, and they sort of reflect steps in the process. The whole redistricting thing is necessitated by population changes that are documented in the decennial US Census. The census is required by the US Constitution and has been conducted every 10 years since 1790. Census completed in years ending in 0 are the only actual enumerations of the population, and therefore the only figures that can be used for redistricting. That accounts for the 10-year cycle. Once the population of the nation and the states is known, House seats are apportioned to the states. Seats in the US House are not apportioned simply by dividing the nation's population by 435, because each state gets one representative regardless of population. When a formula is applied to apportion the remaining 385 seats. States are notified by the clerk of the US House regarding the number of seats apportioned to them, and Kansas was notified this spring that it will continue to have the 4 representatives it's had for the last couple decades. Finally, now that the states know how many seats they have in Congress, they must redistrict or redraw their districts to balance the population, because the whole purpose of this exercise is to have equal voice in the legislature and in Congress, and we do that in part by having districts as close as possible to equal population. So we take the 2.9 million people that we know Kansas has as a total, divide that by 4, and know that our congressional districts will be 734,470. And likewise, we develop the ideal population for House districts by dividing that 2.9 million by 125, which yields an ideal population of 23,504. And the Senate districts, we divide the state population by 40 and get about 73,000 for a Senate district. States, counties, and unified school districts in Kansas that elect representatives from single-member districts also will create new maps based on the 2020 census for those jurisdictions for the same, absolutely the same rationale. Districts need to be as close as possible to equal population. Next slide. The overall, next slide, Michael, sorry. The overall framework for redistricting is created by the interaction of the US Constitution, federal laws such as the Voting Rights Act, and decades of court decisions. Most of the direction for creating congressional districts does arise from case law. Adding a dimension to that frame is the Kansas Constitution, which requires boundaries for the state's House and Senate districts to be drawn every 10 years based on the census. So in the year ending in 2, because the states typically do not receive the census information the minute the count is taken. The Kansas Constitution also requires the legislature to determine the boundaries for the 10 State Board of Education districts, and they are composed each of 4 contiguous Senate districts. Further, the Kansas Constitution provides that the legislative districts must be reviewed by the Supreme Court after they are enacted. This final step in the redistricting process adds a little bit of time to the process and could result in pushing up against the succeeding election that begins with the primary filing deadline for Kansas. So receipt of the census figures, which we now expect to happen next week, triggers the start of the redistricting process, and the filing deadline for the upcoming primary election effectively sets the end of the process. During this round, the legislature will have essentially 9 months to complete the process, along with all the other business it will conduct. Next slide. So the redistricting essentials, and you've probably gotten this from everything I've said so far, the legislature will be creating congressional districts for House districts, 125, Senate districts, 40, and 10 State Board of Education districts. The effective deadline for all of them is the filing deadline, June 1, for the upcoming primary. Next slide. So we've got a bit of the legal framework, but you'll hear some more about that later. The necessary numbers from the census, and now we're down to how the legislature organizes its work. There are 3 legislative committees involved this round with lots of overlapping membership. The Redistricting Advisory Group that was created after the 2021 session is composed of the President of the Senate, Ty Masterson, the Speaker of the House, Ron Rickman, the Senate Minority Leader, Dinah Sykes, the Vice President of the Senate, Rick Wilburn, the House Majority Leader, Dan Hawkins, the House Minority Leader, Tom Sawyer. Those 6 people have that 6-member committee, Redistricting Advisory Group, has traditionally met to work with staff to make sure all the preparatory work is done so that redistricting can get off to a smooth start, usually in the summer preceding the redistricting session. So a lot of their work typically gets done in the census year and perhaps even before, depending on the workload. During the 2010 redistricting cycle, the Legislative Coordinating Council created a redistricting advisory group in 2009. The Senate and House standing committees function just as most other standing committees, although their work is a little more intense and involved. Sometimes, as is the case this year, the 2 standing committees function during the interim as special committees, meeting jointly for specific purposes, like the hearings that will take place next week. Next slide. So this is the composition of the House Redistricting Committee. Typically, legislative leaders pick members for the committees from across the state. And that's a particular focus for the redistricting committees. As you can see, the 5 largest counties have the most representation on the House committee. Only one member of the committee, Representative Brenda Landwehr from Wichita, served on the House Redistricting Committee in 2012. So the committee is without a whole lot of institutional memory. And that may make it even more important for constituents to speak to the committee during this round. We always also note that even if your legislators are not on the committees, they will become involved in the process because the redistricting bills all get voted on the House and Senate floor. So stay in touch with them this summer and fall and into the 22 session about these matters fundamental to our representative democracy. The Senate committee is smaller, as Senate committees are, and is composed, as you see, of some of the names that overlap with the redistricting advisory group. None of the members on this committee served on the reapportionment committee 10 years ago. Next slide. So in the process of doing redistricting every 10 years, Kansas has developed what can easily be thought of as traditional redistricting criteria. And those are used to guide the legislative and congressional map drawing. And a set of criteria or guidelines have been in use in Kansas consistently since the late 1980s. These criteria are found neither in the Constitution nor in statute. They've been adopted by the redistricting committees each decade as guidelines, and as such are not binding except to the extent that they articulate requirements in law. The guidelines for this round of redistricting have not yet been adopted. The proposed guidelines have been posted by the redistricting advisory group, and in their preliminary, their non-adopted form reflect everything that we see here that's been in place for a number of decades. Although not a guideline, the Kansas legislature also has in prior redistricting processes included voter registration information in its redistricting database. That enables map makers to know the partisan makeup of districts as they are assembled. And that information helps with the last guideline or criteria that you see on the slide there, avoiding contests between members of the legislature or the State Board of Education, the election information, and knowing where incumbents live, both of which are incorporated in the database, help with that process. Next slide. So here we have sort of the classic civics textbook picture of how a redistricting map becomes law. As I've reviewed, and this is kind of in summary, the process starts with the census that tells us whether and how much our districts are out of compliance with the ideal of being of equal population. Then the congressional process is that our seats are apportioned to us from the federal level based on that census. The Kansas legislature then gets busy and draws or makes adjustments to the congressional districts to get them back in compliance with one person, one vote. Those are embodied in bills, go through the legislative process, go to the governor for consideration to approve or veto. If they are vetoed, they go back to the legislature for consideration of override, just like any other bill. And if they are approved, once they're approved, then those become the districts that are used in the upcoming 2022 election. On the legislative side, very similar. we start with the census. We find out how out of compliance we are with one person, one vote. We redraw districts to get them back into compliance. Those plans then are embodied in bills, go through the legislative process, go to the governor. And in this case, once approved by the governor, go to the Attorney General, who petitions the Kansas Supreme Court to review them. The court takes those up on an expedited, as an expedited matter, looks them over, determines whether or not those districts are valid or invalid. These are the legislative districts only. And if they are invalid, sends them back to the legislature for some more reworking with some instruction. If they find them valid, they go through onto the process and we begin the 2022 election cycle. Of course, what this civics lesson graph doesn't show is any delays or changes in the process that might occur because a citizen files suit and is a complainant about any part of the process or the resultant districts. And Josh, that may be your segue to talking about legal issues.
Thanks, Mary. Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Pearson. I'm an attorney with ACLU of Kansas. And like Mary said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about legal challenges that might be able to be brought against districts once they are drawn, and specifically about gerrymandering. We've all heard that phrase, gerrymandering. I think most people have a general understanding of what it is, but essentially, the idea of a gerrymandered district or voting district of any kind would be, an advantageously drawn district for one purpose or another, whether it's a political party or for some other purpose. From the standpoint of litigation, there's sort of really two types of gerrymandered districts, two ways to think about challenging a gerrymandered district. And I have them both here up on the slide. So first is racial gerrymandering. So if you could bring a claim that would challenge a district, a drawn district on the grounds that it was preventing certain minority groups from voting, that would implicate the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the major voting rights legislation passed as a result of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was in the room when Lyndon B. Johnson signed it. Lyndon B. Johnson handed Martin Luther King one of the pens that signed the bill. So it's the major civil rights litigation when it comes to voting. And as you can see here, this quote is from Section 2 of that act and makes it impermissible for any state or any subdivision of a state to abridge or deny the right to vote on account of race. So that is impermissible for a legislature to draw districts to exclude minority groups on account of race or on account of color would violate the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and would be something that would state a claim in court. It's important to note that in general, it may or may not matter the intent of the legislature itself. If the effect of the district is to deny people the right to vote because of their race, that could still violate the Voting Rights Act. As opposed to racial gerrymandering, we have partisan gerrymandering, which in recent years has been a hotter topic in many ways. And the takeaway that I think is important here is that essentially partisan gerrymandering is legal, that the courts have, for all intents and purposes, refused to get involved to challenges to voting districts that were drawn to be advantageous to one political party or the other. So this quote here is from, I think this, if not the most, one of the most, and certainly a substantial case in the area, this Richo versus Common Cause case. Justice Roberts wrote what you can see here, that there is, according to the Supreme Court, at least as it stands now, no right to to districts drawn to make political parties have equal power. So an important lesson there. Can we advance to the next slide, please? I wanted to mention briefly this idea of majority minority districts. So a district that is made up or purposely drawn in order to create a district that gives minority votes more power. And under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that type of district would be valid. That is something that can be done, and something that would be a way to counteract the dilution of minority votes across districts otherwise. In other words, it obviously could be very possible to draw otherwise seemingly fair districts where you have minority groups split out among the districts so that they essentially have no power in those districts to elect legislatures. So one of the ways to counteract that, or one of the ways to address that at least, would be for legislatures to draw majority minority districts. In other words, districts which are made up in majority by minority groups. And if you could go to the next slide, please. And so I mentioned that for you all in part because to us, for a couple of reasons. One, I noted, on my first slide, the sort of legality, the permissibility of political gerrymandering, of partisan gerrymandering. And then also when it comes to challenging impermissible dilution of minority votes, there are things that courts will consider to determine whether or not that has happened, and then whether or not a majority minority district would be valid. And what that requires is essentially evidence, participation in the legislative process, and people's voices in the legislature when they are drawing maps. And so this is sort of my incentive to you to tell you that it is better to address these issues now. It is better to conceive of this process as a political process. And in fact, the courts have said that this is indeed a political process. And that to hope for successful litigation after districts are drawn in order to challenge something that we find unfair about one of the districts, that should be a last resort in many ways. And so this is sort of my call to action that to you that this is a political process, this is a legislative process, and it's a reason to be involved at this time. So with that, I will pass to Troy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Troy Spain with the Kansas Civic Engagement Table. I think Mary gave a great 40,000-foot view of kind of the whole process in its entirety. Josh was able to give you kind of a 20,000, 10,000-foot view of how legally things are going to function. I'd like to bring you down to ground level, and that's what a regular Kansan can do. And to dig into that, we have to first really define what is a community of interest, which is the piece of this that that the legislature will consider when they're drawing districts. So on the graph here, we've got things that can bring communities together and can show geographic similarity. So we've got geography, we've got culture and ethnicity, we've got policy concerns, and then where those overlap, you have like shared events, historical neighborhoods, whether they're a metro or a rural area, and whether they have shared school or water boards, similar work advocacy and social stances. So things that can bind a neighborhood together and kind of bring a coalesced group of folks together. Usually by now we have some form of guideline, and now in the process, I mean, we have some form of guideline that can really talk about how you can get involved. Those usually include like written descriptions of your community. They can involve community issue statements. So things, if there is a social stance or if there is a concern about a water board or something, there's a way to submit that to the legislature. And we also have a process for getting boundary maps that can be drawn using free software online, using that census data that Mary spoke of to kind of dig in and really learn more about what, and to functionally actually create your own map that can be submitted for their consideration. Right now, we don't have any of those. What we have is a pathway for testimony to be given. So if you'll flip to the next one here. So I want to really dig in and have you guys take just a second to think about what your story could be. What could define your community for you? What do your neighborhood, city, and region have in common? What organizations are you personally involved with that have people across your community? What religious affiliations and what do they do in the community? How do you define yourself, whether that by race, sexuality, gender? Those groups can sometimes have community organizations or community groups that work together. What ties do you have? So alma maters are a big community that can pull people together, trade groups, union groups. All of those things can bind communities together. They can show pieces that can be broken down later when you're starting to build maps based on anything. So if you have like a similar income or standard of living with people around you, if you have similar pieces that are going to think about. So you can define a community and it can be very personal to you, but it can also be something that you share outwardly with a large group. So when we're drawing those legislative maps, there are only going to be 4 of them. What is it that breaks the state up into 4 unique areas? And they can be things like historical. We have a historical precedent for where those districts are, but we also have a lot of other pieces that go into that. So if you can try and identify just the 1 or 2 things out of that whole list that maybe would bind you to your community, that would make you get interested, then you can start building a story off of that. So we're going to go through the testimony piece next, if you want to flip that for the next piece here. So when you build either written or oral testimony, there's going to be some major components to that. The first one is just the header. It's a pretty simple process. There's information that they need in order to file this on the public record and give you your voice in the state. So this is going to be, first you have to define what you're doing, whether it's oral or written testimony or both. You can put your information, your contact information, and they need that because they're going to file this long term. It's going to be publicly accessible for folks to look at. You want to talk about what you want. So proponent for transparent and fair redistricting, and who it's addressed to, and then where you're going to present that. So right now we only have a process for the town halls for getting written and public and oral testimony in the current town halls. As they bring out more guidelines and rules, there's probably going to be submissions for at least written information later on that we'll have to deal with. Flip the next one. So then you move into an opening. This is where you just greet the chairman and the members of the committee. You thank them for your opportunity to supply written testimony or oral testimony and walk through what you're supporting and why it's important to you. Flip the next guy. Then you really want to break down that personal story that you've created. So whether it's some kind of community organization, some kind of organizational involvement, even if it's just a thing that's unique to you and a small group of people that are around you, and you want to remain connected to them in some form when they draw the lines, you want to define that and really remember that your testimony is going to separate and inform the committee on what it is that is unique to your perspective that is different from theirs. So go ahead and flip to the next guy there. And then you just want to close. So usually these statements are a singular page. They don't have to be long and lengthy. They can just state exactly what you want and what you think would be fair. And then you just close out like a normal salutation. So you restate your point, go through, say thank you for their time, and then give any information that's pertinent. Currently, the process is that you have to save that written statement as a PDF, or that oral statement that is going to be read or presented as a PDF, and send that to get on the schedule. And there's the email address there, but we're going to talk about some other options here going forward. And you can go to the next one, Mike. So then what happens once you've spent your time, right? Like we're asking you to spend some of your valuable home time really breaking down what it is that's important to you, why, and get involved in a process. So what happens with that? Well, the big piece is it becomes public record. And once an item is on public record, it's accessible not only by the legislature, but by other groups that are trying to build redistricting information. So whether they are going to be presenting maps to the legislature, whether they are going to be advocating, they can point to your testimony and work through what you have stated. So it also is really important from what Josh said about gerrymandering and things. If we get into any kind of litigation later, all of that's accessible and useful in litigation on the back end. So I really appreciate it. We'll turn you back over to Mike here to go through next steps.
Thanks, Troy. And folks, I would be remiss if I did not go back and hit a slide that I forgot in the beginning. I have about 20 windows open on my screen, so I do apologize, but I would like to introduce you to KS Fair Maps and some of the coalition partners. And so you can see here that we're nonpartisan grassroots engagement effort. And we want an equitable redistricting process that is accessible to all Kansans and allows for meaningful participation, regardless of location, ability, and language, is free of partisan tactics and bias, and results in equitable districts based on constitution, law, and communities of interest. And to the right, you can see the list of some of, or most of the coalition partners. I want to thank them for being a part of KS Fair Maps and helping to put together today's presentation. So now, piggybacking on what Troy said, there are simple steps that you can take to make an impact on how your legislative districts, school boards, and water board lines are drawn. And the first is to use your voice. So if you can, please show up in person and submit oral testimony. If you are submitting oral testimony only, we still ask, and the rules still state, the directions still state to submit written testimony as well. And this will get you on the agenda for the public town hall. If you aren't able to make it in person, write that written testimony and submit it to the Kansas Legislative Research Department. Or, and I'll talk about this next, you can use a form that KS Fair Maps created to take some of the burden and barrier to access off of you. If you can't do either, you can't show up for a town hall, you cannot write testimony for whatever reason, show up. So if you don't want to give oral testimony, just still show up. Their strength is in numbers. We want bodies there to show the committee that people, are very interested in this process and their government, and they want fair maps. And then get at least one person to join you in this process, whether it be in person, written, both in person and written testimony, or simply showing up to the town hall. And I spoke about, and I can't advance my slide now. I spoke about testimony before, so I apologize. Slide is not advancing for some reason. There we go. All over the place. Here we go. So the KS Fair Maps Coalition, we put together a form, and what this does, it will take the burden off of you to completely write your own testimony, and then have to make a PDF of that testimony and then email it in to get on the agenda, or to just supply the testimony for a specific town hall. So I've just taken a screenshot here of our form, and it kind of goes through what you'll be asked, or some of the rules for the form itself. And it's really simple. It'll just be a plug and play, really, if you will. So there'll be a few questions for you to click if it's written, oral, or both. Put in your name, contact information that's required, and then about 3 spaces where you can share your story on that form. and just a little preview of what that completed letter of testimony will look like. So it will follow this form here once it is once it's generated on the back end, and then we will submit it, as I mentioned, to the Kansas Legislative Research Department per the guidelines on the website, so you have nothing to worry about. And last but not least, we are offering resources for you, or to you, on the KS Fair Maps toolkit, which is on our website at ksfairmaps.org. There'll be a recording of this event. We'll have the slide deck available so that you can review that. We'll have templates for testimony. Of course, the form for you to submit testimony through us. If you are doing that, though, we're going to need it a little bit earlier than the official deadline. So we'll need it the day before, but we'll need you to submit that form at 3 p.m. by 3 p.m. instead of 5 p.m., just so that we can make sure that everything comes out the right way and we get it submitted on time for you. We'll also have some graphics to share in email or on social media to get more people, your friends, your families, your networks, to join in the process with you. And we'll have a ton of other resources there for you to take a look at. And of course, if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to reach out to one of us. Mary, Eileen, who is with ACLU but was not able to join us today, she can relay to Josh, Troy, or Michael, and that's me. And now I am going to bring everybody back to the screen to answer some of the audience questions that we have. All right, let's look at the first question that came through. And that is, NNO purpose or effect of diluting minority voting strength. What does that mean? And Mary, I believe that came through when you were speaking.
Sorry, that's as much as anything one of those legal questions that I'm probably going to punt to Josh. But in that guide, that is a guideline that really grows out of case law and the Voting Rights Act. So as I said, some of the guidelines really are, while we always think of them as being non-binding, the ones that grow out of the law are binding. So Josh, do you want to talk about purpose and intent a little bit?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So that phrase in particular, it means if a district is drawn with the purpose of diluting minority votes, and most likely that for that phrase to be effective, or if you were to see that in the case, it would be referring to race or color. And in other words, it would be a situation where districts were drawn in such a way so that a minority group, which may or may not be, but often is politically cohesive, would be split among multiple districts in such a way that they can actually exert no real power in elections. And so the legislature, in drawing the district in that way, is diluting the power of the minority group by separating them up, splitting them among multiple districts, so that the majority groups in each of those districts then are able to exert all the political power in elections. Does that answer the question?
I believe so, but if not, please resubmit the question or follow up to it, and we will hopefully get to it before the end of the event. Another question, excuse me, or a question on gerrymandering, and I believe you answered this in your presentation, Josh, but how is gerrymandering legal, and isn't it a racist behavior? So if there's nothing else to add, then we can move to the next question.
Sure, I think it's in the slides, but yeah, happy to say more if you'd like.
Excellent. Should the text of the two types of gerrymandering be the same?
They should not, and hopefully we can maybe correct that when we put up the slide deck. I have a corrected slide ready to go. So
perfect. We'll get that put up. Why are the courts reluctant to get involved with partisan gerrymandering? Josh, I think all these questions are for you.
Okay, that's fine. I think reluctant to get involved. I think I might have said that it's probably too weak a term. Actually, I mean, it's just not an issue the courts will get involved in. That it is what the courts have said is that, and what not the courts, the court, what the Supreme Court has said, is that there simply is no right, there is no constitutional norm to politically or partisan or fair partisan districts. That And in essence, what the court has said is that drawing districts and conducting elections is a political process, and it is in its very nature partisan. And so there is no right to a fair partisan map in terms of political parties. Where it does get complicated is where there is often a racial element that can loosely track partisan maps. And so there are often claims for racially discriminatory districts that may seem to blend with districts drawn with partisan advantage. But as a sort of protected or prohibited basis for drawing a map, there just simply is no right as it stands right now for fair partisan maps.
Thanks, Josh. There's a question in here about if the groups represented feel the past Kansas guidelines for redistricting are fair and reasonable. Did anyone want to answer that question, or do we want to keep looking forward?
I'll take a swing at one of the guidelines that the league has highlighted in a number of different places that it would like to see the legislature drop, and that is the one that says contest between incumbent members of the legislature or the State Board of Education will be avoided whenever possible. That sounds a little bit like incumbent protection, and the league's position on that is that by incorporating that consideration in drawing new maps, one might be building in a bias that will simply carry forward then for decades in the future. There's language, that's the language for legislative districts. There's similar-ish language in the congressional guidelines that talks about preserving the cores of existing districts, which kind of could have the same outcome. So that's one of the guidelines that the league has highlighted as perhaps needing to be eliminated.
Thank you. A question that's bubbled to the top is, I live in Wyandotte County, but my dentist, my doctor, my chiropractor are all in Johnson County. Only my vet is in Wyandotte County. Is that important for a community of interest? Troy?
Yeah, I think that's really where the metro versus rural divide kind of comes in. So you're talking about things that are all part of your metropolitan community that are important to your day-to-day activities. And so defining that metro as something that's important to keep together in your representation can be really important, because it can change the way that rules are written and lines are drawn and all kinds of things for you that could change your day-to-day activities. If all of a sudden there was not the person representing you that was tied to the rest of that Johnson County community, even though you live in Wyandotte, if you had a different representative, they may be looking outwardly at other parts of the state instead of at the Wyandotte County area or the Johnson County area and representing what you want. So keeping a metropolitan area together in representation is usually one of the considerations that we ask for.
Great, thank you. Troy, I think we'll probably stick with you for this one. How do personal stories, aspirations contribute to the definition of a community interest? It seems it would be a lot of individual perspectives and ideas for better impact participants.
Sure. I mean, I think what they do is they inform what communities you are part of, right? So part of my day-to-day, right, is that I have 2 young girls in elementary and middle school, and they have a school board that has representation lines that are going to be redrawn. And so for me, I may not realize that those lines are being redrawn in the local government. I may not be involved in that process, but it's going to affect the day-to-day of what decisions that school board makes, right? So to that point, like anything can be that, right? It can be a tie to a larger community that can be represented in some way. And whether that means that it's because you get involved with an organization and that organization then has a larger impact on, maybe producing maps later on or looking into, submitting testimony of its own. Those are all things that can really help kind of push more information to those legislative bodies as they make decisions.
Great. Even though there's no right for fair partisan districting, does it hurt to indicate a concern about being fair to all voters when writing testimony? And Mary, did you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think the fairness of the maps, and of course that's going to be a perception on each of our parts coming from our unique experiences, but that's always the thing to talk about with redistrictors, and the degree to which partisan considerations get in the way of that fundamental fairness is also something to address.
Sticking with testimony, and I might share screen for this. If one were to write testimony, do you have suggestions to write, I know what you're trying to do without offending the people that we are trying to sway? And let me see if I can pull this up and show part of that form that I was talking about. All right. So there's a couple of additional requests that you can add to your testimony if you are submitting through our form. And one of those is, let me scroll back up here so we can see the whole thing. Never mind. All right. So one of those is, I don't have the information to make a decision or to give you something to consider on fair maps because the U.S. Census data has not been released yet, and you don't have that information either, right? So that's a very respectful way to say that, because we do ask that you are respectful when you address the committee, either in person or via written text. And there'll be a couple other examples on that testimony form should you decide to use that. Next question, is there anything different we should say related to state legislature redistricting as opposed to federal districts? First one to jump gets it.
Okay, I'll jump. So I would say that what you want to do is find the one that you're going to give the best example for. So think about the community stuff that you're interested in, think about what you're involved in, and then find the one that you can make the best case for, because there's going to be a lot of people submitting testimony. There's going to be a lot of stuff to go through. So the more succinct you can be, the better off you're going to be. If you want to say something about more than one, add those as points so that they're very clear, or add them just to your written testimony and then give your oral about the one that's most important to you.
And then to piggyback, in your oral testimony, you can say, I've expanded on other points in my written testimony. Please review that.
If I can jump in here, sure, just a minute on this question, because I think there really is, if I'm reading the question correctly, there's an important scale difference when you're talking about congressional districts in Kansas versus legislative districts. And that scale difference, I think, makes a big difference in what you say and how you describe the community and how you identify those issues that are liable to be concerns of that community that fall in the bucket that go to Congress. So I think largely it's a scale issue. So think big. What does the county I live in and the county next to me and the county south of me have about them that are unique on issues that are liable to be dealt with in Congress? You just have to pull out the zoom a little bit when you're addressing the congressional districts.
Thank you, Mary. Josh, anything to add on that? Okay, there's a question about Q&A sessions in the town hall, and as far as we know, there will be no Q&A. As I mentioned earlier, the official rules haven't come out for the town halls, but with only 75 minutes per town hall, we doubt there'll be any time for Q&A. And at some town halls, at the larger town halls, you may only have 30 seconds to speak. So they're just going to, what we understand is they're just going to divide the time for public comment by the number of people that are there. And that won't be the whole 75 minutes because the committee will obviously have an opening and closing remarks. So if you want to say something, please submit testimony. And then let's see. Are these redistricting meetings important not only for weighing in ahead of the process, but also to effectively serve as receipts for potential future legal challenges in the case of gerrymandering maps drawn by the legislature? Josh?
So the short answer is yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, the more that is sort of in the record, so to speak, the more an attorney or attorneys after the fact would potentially have to be able to work with to challenge illegal maps. But I just with the caveat that I think it's really important though to sort of first and foremost conceive of this entire process as a political one, and that you are, and I think the goal here and the goal of the involvement here is to insist that our legislatures draw fair maps, and that as a general matter, the legislature has the power to draw the maps that they want to draw, and so it's important that they know what their constituents think is appropriate. And so again, yes, I think it's important that we have things in the record should there be some challenge later on, but for the most part, this is a political process, and I think the focus should be on asking the legislature to draw appropriate and fair maps.
Sticking with town halls for the next couple of questions. Cindy asked or said, I heard on NPR yesterday that the Kansas District Redistricting Committee has added more meetings based on feedback received. Is that true? No. There was a news story that Reichman said they're looking into virtual town halls. I don't know the exact verbiage, but they're looking into additional town halls, virtual town halls, after the US Census data drops. But we have not seen a schedule for that. It would have been nice if that were released in the original schedule so people knew that was coming up. But easy answer or quick answer, not sure. We hope that there will be. Wear a t-shirt, show up to a town hall. This next question is how can we present or express our efforts for fair maps? Yes, wear a t-shirt, show up, be respectful. Don't speak out of turn or yell. It doesn't help. It doesn't help anyone. Please give a list of meeting dates, times, and places that I can have on PDF. I'll tell you what, the most up-to-date information on those town halls is going to be on the KLRD website. There is a link in the, the slide deck that we're going to make available today. There's also a link on ksfairmaps.org. So I would go there before printing out a static PDF, because there have already been several changes since the schedule has been released, and some of them have been addresses for the different locations. Now we are right at 10 o'clock right now. I want to respect everyone's time. Do the panelists have a few more minutes to take a couple more questions? If not, okay, great. Let's see. In order to write testimony, do you have to point out a community of interest? Is Johnson County, and this is Johnson County specific, itself a community of interest, or Johnson County and Wyandotte combined? We touched on this earlier. The question relates to the 3rd congressional district.
I've done quite a bit of community of interest work, and I would say yes and yes. Communities of interest are an interesting creature to the extent that they are self-identified. If you feel your community extends all 4 directions out to the edge of your county borders, then it does. If you think your community extends to the county north of you, the county south of you, the county east and west of you, then by golly, it does. So that's the thing that makes a community of interest such an interesting, not to get redundant here, creature to describe. And that's why it's particularly useful for it to be described in a group setting. So you and 17 of your best friends get together and think about what defines your community for you. That becomes then the more robust description. But absolutely, it can be a whole county. It can be a multi-county area. So frequently, the legislature gets testimony from Southeast Kansas that the 9-block square of counties that occupy the southeast corner of the state is a unique community of interest. It shares a unique history, a unique settlement pattern, unique industrial history, and so forth. And that's fair game, just as much as, you know, one teeny tiny little neighborhood could also be a community of interest.
Thank you. So there's a couple of clarification questions on whether you are submitting testimony to the committee through KS Fair Maps, and we submit that on your behalf, or if you're submitting straight to the committee through the KLRD website. And I'm going to pop into chat right now that link to the official instructions for submitting testimony through KLRD, right? If you use our form and we are going to submit testimony on your behalf, we need your testimony to be submitted the day before the meeting that you would like that testimony introduced at 3 p.m. We have our cutoff a couple of hours before the official cutoff at 5, so that we can run a mail merge and make sure everything looks good, PDF it, write the body of the email that we're sending, and make sure that we have every single person listed. And if you're doing written, oral, or written and oral testimony, to get the correct information to the committee. And so that's for you that we ask for a couple of hours of grace period there to make sure that we are getting everything in correctly. If you submit testimony for us to pass on your behalf, you do not need to contact KLRD, right? We will do that for you. We will tell them the type of testimony you're submitting, for what date and what town hall. And we will make sure, if you are doing oral or written and oral, that we request that you be placed on the agenda for that day. Scrolling through the questions. So we've talked about just showing up, right? Just showing up but not speaking. And so there's a question about, what does that do? What's the purpose of just showing up to one of the town halls in person? Troy, did you want to take that?
Yeah. What it does is it shows that people are interested in the process and that they want to get involved. If we are pushing for future dates and meetings later on, different accessibility features, all kinds of things like that, it's really useful to have a track record of people showing up. That is probably why short notice was made, so that we could we would have a difficult time proving these are important, and then later there's a good reason to not have any more. So if we have a lot of people show up, if we show up as in a group, if we have, you know, everyone's wearing yellow t-shirts or whatever it is that makes sense for your community, that sets a precedent that these are important and that they are useful, and then we can push for more of them in the future. So
thanks. And if you want to submit oral testimony, you want to deliver oral testimony in person, you have to deliver your testimony. Someone else cannot deliver your testimony for you. So if you can't make the town hall, submit written only testimony. It was a question in the Q&A that I thought was pretty important.
Yeah, but another part of that is that it doesn't, if you have a bunch of friends in the room, it's not as scary to give your testimony. It can be pretty intimidating, especially if it's your first time speaking in front of the committees, because they look super official, right? And you're standing there as a community member trying to make a case of some kind that you've never made before publicly. So having a couple of people behind you kind of clapping and kind of egging you on can really help and make a big difference in how your testimony looks to the committee.
And then I think we'll have time for just this one last question. And if possible, we will take these questions that we didn't get to and see if we can answer them and put a PDF with a toolkit so that you still might get answers to these questions. Bubble at the top. So what, if anything, can we do to fight partisan gerrymandering? Josh?
I think there's a lot you can do, and actually being here and showing up at these town hall meetings is one of the best things you can do. Just because a lawyer couldn't later bring a lawsuit over the issue doesn't mean it's right or wrong. And I think telling your legislators that you think the district should be fair, both in these meetings and town halls and in the redistricting process itself, but also just being in touch with your legislators and making sure that they know that you as the community and as their voters are insisting on fair maps, and that they, to make them afraid of a political cost if they draw unfair maps. That's really the most powerful way that you could do this. Even if even if you could sue over it, that would still be the most powerful way to ensure fair maps.
Excellent. And does anyone have any closing statements or comments before we sign off for the day?
Yeah, I'd like to thank everybody for being here. It's been a great conversation. We got really, really good questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And thank you all. And we hope you make it to a hearing close to you.
I'll piggyback on that and say a lot of us will be at those hearings. So if you see us, come up, say hi. We look forward to getting to know you guys. If you need help beforehand, all of our information is on the slide deck. Please reach out. There's a short timeline, but we're more than happy to reach out and help as much as we can in that.
Yeah, just my thanks to everyone both involved in the presentation as well as everyone attending. It's inspiring. So
yeah. Well, and I'd like to echo that sentiment. Thank you so much for being involved today. We had over 375 people register for this, so we're expecting 375 at least pieces of testimony to come out of this event today. Plus, you're bringing friends, so at least double that number. As everyone stated, please reach out. We are here to help. We want this to be as simple a process for you as possible in order to get your voice heard in this very critical redistricting process. Thank you again for being here, and make sure to check out ksfairmaps.org and look for that email later today with a link to the recording and the toolkit.